All right, let's do a deep dive into something that I think always leads to some pretty interesting philosophical conversations. We're going to be talking about nationalism. And I know you're into philosophy, so this one's for you. We're going to try to go a little bit beyond the surface level definitions. We're going to be looking at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on nationalism, see if we can really untangle some of the complexities.
Yeah, it's one of those concepts that seems like it's really simple when you first hear it, but then the more you dig into it, the more fascinating and complex it becomes.
It really does.
Yeah.
We're going to try to unpack some of the different types of nationalism, look at arguments for it and against it, and then see how it plays out in the 21st century on the global stage.
Yeah, and the ethical dilemmas that come up, right? Because nationalism can really pull us in a bunch of different directions when it comes to things like loyalty and identity and our responsibilities to others.
So the Stanford Encyclopedia starts out by breaking down nationalism into two main parts. First, there's this profound care about your national identity. This feeling of being connected to your nation's history, its culture. That's pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that sense of belonging is something that a lot of people can relate to on some level. But then it's the second part that really gets interesting because that's where you get into the pursuit of political sovereignty for your nation. And that's where all those philosophical debates start swirling.
Right. Because then sovereignty itself is a tricky concept. Are we talking about complete independence, or could it mean some form of autonomy but within a larger state?
Yeah, exactly. And as we're going through all this, I think it's really important to make a distinction between like civic loyalty, like what we often call patriotism, versus ethnic nationalism. And both of them, they involve caring about your nation. But ethnic nationalism takes it a step further by really linking that national identity to a specific ethnic or cultural group.
Right. So it's not just about loving your country, but it's about emphasizing your particular group's culture and heritage within that country. And that raises some tricky questions about who's in and who's out.
For sure. Yeah, it really brings up those classic philosophical questions of like belonging, identity, and whether the interests of one group could actually clash with the interests of another.
Now, here's a question that I think philosophers love to debate. Are nations even real things?
Mm?
Or are they just these imagined communities? Like, are they concrete entities?
Mm.
Or are they constructed through these shared narratives and symbols?
Oh, man, that's a debate that has gone on forever. But I think what's really interesting is that a lot of modern philosophers are less concerned about whether or not nations are real in the sort of objective sense, because their argument is that even if nations are imagined, they still have real-world consequences. Because they shape how we see ourselves, our values. They drive political action.
So even if a nation is like this collective story we tell ourselves, it's still a story with huge power.
Absolutely. And that kind of leads us to another interesting debate about like the origins of nationalism. So you have some scholars, we call them modernists, and they argue that nationalism is actually a pretty recent phenomenon. It arises alongside modern nation states. So think like industrialization, mass communication, the need to create these shared identities to unify these diverse populations.
So nationalism is like a product of modernity. But then you have the primordialists.
Yeah.
Right? And they have this completely different perspective.
Yeah, the primordialists believe that nations, or at least like the seeds of them, they've existed since ancient times. And they point to things like shared ancestry, language, cultural traditions as evidence that there are these deep historical roots that go way before the modern nation state.
So it's like nations are these ancient tribes that have evolved, but those bonds of kinship and heritage are still there.
Very
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah, and then there's also this third perspective, which is kind of a middle ground. And this perspective suggests that while ethnic groups have existed for a very long time, nationalism as a political ideology really emerges when those groups become politicized. So it's not just about shared culture, but it's about actively seeking political power, self-determination.
It's like taking that shared identity and turning it into a tool or a force for political change.
Yeah.
And that can get really messy and potentially dangerous.
Oh, yeah. That's when we start to see the different flavors of nationalism emerge, each with its own implications for how we view ethics and politics.
And, you know, speaking of flavors, the Stanford Encyclopedia makes a really key distinction between classical nationalism and liberal nationalism. Can you explain that for us?
Yeah, so I think classical nationalism is what a lot of people think of when they hear the word nationalism. It's that strong, almost unwavering focus on creating a fully sovereign state for a specific ethno-national group. And often there's a huge emphasis on traditional culture, traditional values.
Yeah, it's that my nation first mentality. And while that can be a super powerful unifying force, it also raises some concerns about potential exclusion, even intolerance.
For sure. And that's kind of where liberal nationalism comes in. And this tries to reconcile those strong national feelings with the principles of a liberal democracy.
So it's all about finding that sweet spot, right? That balance between the love for your nation and respect for individual rights, for diversity, those core values of a free society.
Yeah, finding that balance can be really tricky. So, liberal nationalists, they acknowledge individual rights and are more open to multiculturalism within a nation state. It's less about imposing a single cultural vision and more about creating a framework where different groups can coexist peacefully while still sharing that sense of national belonging.
Now, it's important to remember that nationalist claims, they exist on this spectrum.
Right.
At one end, you have those who want total cultural dominance for their group. On the other end, you have those advocating for, let's say, cultural autonomy within a larger state.
And everything in between. Yet you have to remember that nationalism isn't this monolithic thing. There are all sorts of different views on how national identity should be expressed, how it should be protected. And of course, this all leads to some pretty serious moral questions.
Because that pull towards your own group, that nationalist solidarity, sometimes can clash with the rights and the well-being of others, especially those who are outside that group.
Definitely. It creates this kind of inherent tension within nationalism, right? Because on the one hand, you have this potential for deep connection, a shared purpose. But on the other hand, you have the potential for exclusion, discrimination, and even violence against those who are perceived as different or as a threat to that nation's unity.
It really is a double-edged sword. And I think as we go further down this philosophical rabbit hole, we're going to need to deal with both sides of that sword. We'll look at the arguments for and against nationalism after we hear from our sponsor.
So let's get into some of the arguments in favor of nationalism. What are the philosophical reasons that people give for believing that nations and national identity are so important?
Yeah, so the Stanford Encyclopedia lays out quite a few different arguments. One that I find particularly interesting is this idea of intrinsic value, that ethno-national communities have intrinsic value because they're these sources of meaning, belonging, and cultural continuity.
It's like our cultures and traditions and shared history, those things give our lives context and meaning. Without that connection to a larger national narrative, our own individual lives might feel a bit rootless, you know?
Yeah, it's like we need those shared stories, traditions to kind of ground us, help us understand where we fit in.
Exactly. And then there's the flourishing argument, which kind of builds on that idea. And this one suggests that individuals can only truly flourish within their own national community.
Is it because it's within that specific community that we can really understand our own lives and values?
Yeah, that's the idea. That our national cultures provide a framework for understanding morality, for social interactions, personal growth. It's where we learn right from wrong. We develop our sense of self, and ultimately, we find fulfillment.
So it's like our national communities, they give us a moral compass, a set of shared values that help us navigate the world.
Right, and that also ties into the identity argument, which really emphasizes how these national communities shape our individual identity. So, our sense of self is really intertwined with our national belonging. We inherit a sense of history, language, heritage, and those become really integral parts of who we are.
It's that I am because we are. Our identities are stronger because we're connected to something larger than ourselves.
Okay, now let's get a little bit more philosophically complex here. Let's talk about the argument for moral understanding. This one digs into the idea that nations are really crucial for developing what philosophers call thick moral values.
Okay, remind me, thick moral values. What are those again?
Okay, so thick values are those values that are deeply embedded in a specific culture or tradition, as opposed to these abstract universal principles. It's kind of like the difference between knowing the rules of a game versus understanding those unspoken customs and strategies that really make it meaningful.
So thick values are more about those lived experiences, those cultural norms, those historical narratives that really shape our ethical understanding.
Exactly. And proponents of this argument would say that our national communities are where we learn to appreciate and embody those thick moral values. It gives us that context for really developing a nuanced understanding of ethics and how to navigate all those complex human relationships.
So it's like our national communities are like a moral training ground in a way.
Yeah, you could think of it that way. And then you have the diversity argument. And this one focuses on the value of preserving all those distinct national cultures as unique expressions of human experience. The idea here is that the world is just a richer, more vibrant place because we have this tapestry of national cultures, each with its own perspective, its own unique traditions.
Oh, I love that analogy of the tapestry. It's like,
Oh.
imagine a world where everyone dressed the same, ate the same food, listened to the same music.
Yeah, it would be so boring. The diversity of national cultures really adds spice to life. It exposes us to different ways of thinking, challenges our assumptions. And proponents of this argument, they say that protecting those national cultures is really important to prevent this global homogenization.
Right, makes sense. Now, what about the argument from justice?
Yeah, this one comes up a lot when we're talking about self-determination. So the idea here is that national self-determination can be a form of self-defense against oppression, or a way to correct these historical injustices.
Like we see in colonial situations where a colonized people might invoke national self-determination as part of their struggle for independence.
Exactly. It's the idea that each nation has a right to govern itself, free from external control.
So in that sense, nationalism can be a really powerful force for liberation and creating a more just world.
And last but not least, there's the success argument. And this one takes a more, pragmatic approach. And it points to the historical track record of nation states when it comes to things like democracy, equality, and economic development.
So it's not so much about the ideals of nationalism, but more about how effective it's been at actually achieving these positive outcomes.
Exactly. Proponents of this argument would say that a lot of the most prosperous and egalitarian societies are actually nation states, that national solidarity can be a really powerful motivator for collective action, for social progress.
Okay, so we've looked at the arguments for nationalism, but like you said earlier, there's another side to this coin. What are some of the philosophical criticisms that people make against nationalism?
Well, one of the big criticisms is that national partiality, this idea that we favor our own nation, can lead to discrimination against those who are outside that group, right? And that could potentially undermine those universal human rights that we strive for.
It's that us versus them mentality that can lead to prejudice, to xenophobia.
Right. If you're prioritizing your own nation above all else, it's easy to start seeing those outside your group as less deserving of respect, of basic rights. And historically, we know that kind of thinking has fueled so much conflict, so much injustice.
Another criticism I've heard is that nationalism can stifle creativity and cultural exchange because it becomes too focused on preserving one specific tradition.
Yeah, that fear of cultural contamination, it can be a powerful thing. But critics argue that cultures are always evolving and that trying to freeze them in time is both futile and harmful.
It's like trying to create a garden where only one type of flower is allowed to grow. It might look neat, but it's going to lack that vibrancy and beauty of a diverse ecosystem.
Exactly. Cultures thrive on exchange, on interaction, not isolation. And that's where the cosmopolitan perspective comes in, right? Emphasizing our shared humanity and the importance of going beyond these national boundaries to create a more just and peaceful world.
So it's about recognizing that we can be proud of our own national heritage, but also acknowledge our interconnectedness and responsibility to all humans, no matter where they come from.
Now, in the 21st century, we've seen the rise of a particularly potent form of nationalism,
Yeah.
and that's right-wing populism. And this movement often blends that ethnic nationalism with a populist political style, and it kind of pits the pure people against the corrupt elite.
Yeah, and we've seen this playing out all over the globe, haven't we, where politicians tap into people's fears and anxieties about globalization, immigration, economic uncertainty, and then they blame these problems on elites, on outsiders.
It's this really divisive rhetoric that really preys on that us versus them dynamic. And it creates a sense of grievance, resentment that can be really easily exploited for political gain. And this kind of brings us to another challenge that's facing the world today, and that's the migration crisis. And this has really brought the debate between nationalism and cosmopolitanism to the forefront.
Because on the one hand, you have those who argue that nations have a right to control their own borders, protect their national identity, and this often translates into stricter immigration policies and a more cautious approach to refugees.
But then on the other hand, you have those who argue that we have this moral obligation to help people who are fleeing persecution, fleeing violence, regardless of where they come from. And it's a really complex ethical dilemma, and there are no easy answers.
And it raises all these questions about the role of the nation state in this globalized world that we live in. Like, can nations prioritize their own citizens while still upholding their responsibilities to those in need beyond their borders?
That's a question that we're going to continue to grapple with for sure. And it's the perfect segue into the final part of our deep dive, where we're going to explore those ethical dilemmas in a little bit more depth. So, we talked about how nationalism can lead to these calls for stricter border controls, especially with this huge migration crisis going on. But even liberal nationalists, the ones who are generally in favor of more inclusive societies, they still acknowledge that there needs to be some kind of limit on immigration.
Yeah, it's not just about shutting everybody out, right?
Right. They say that nations, national communities, they have a right to preserve their character, their culture,
Yeah.
and that just completely unchecked immigration could threaten that.
Yeah. It's tricky because you want to be compassionate and welcoming, but you also have to think about what the impact might be on like the existing social fabric.
Exactly.
Well,
And one approach that I think is gaining some traction is this idea of focusing more on the root causes of migration. So things like poverty, conflict, climate change, these are all these push factors that are forcing people to leave their homes in the first place.
yeah, so instead of just dealing with the symptom, you actually try to cure the disease.
Exactly. If you can create more stability and more opportunities in those countries that people are fleeing from, then maybe they won't need to migrate in the first place. I mean, it's definitely a long-term solution, but it's probably a lot more humane.
Makes sense. But in the meantime, we still have to deal with, the millions of people who are already migrating. And like we talked about before, there are different levels of responsibility that we might have towards these people.
Yeah, so think of it kind of like in stages. First, there's the immediate aid. So for refugees, people who are fleeing immediate danger, that's food, shelter, medical care, all of that basic stuff.
Right. That's just that basic humanitarian impulse to help people who are in need, no matter where they come from.
Right. But then there's the second stage, and that's long-term settlement for immigrants. This is where integration becomes a really big deal. So things like learning the language, job training, cultural exchange.
So helping people become like productive members of their new communities while also respecting their cultural differences. So
Ah,
it has to go both ways.
absolutely. And then finally, you have the question of citizenship. And this is where things get really complicated, both politically and
Oh,
philosophically.
yeah. I can see why, because then you start getting into questions of belonging and identity and who gets to participate in the political life of a nation. It really gets to the heart of what it even means to be a nation.
One way to think about these different stages of responsibility is through something called the Samaritan to deeper measures model.
Okay, what's that?
So it starts with this idea of Samaritanism, that very basic ethical principle of helping those who are in need, even strangers. So that first stage, providing that basic aid and support, that's about fulfilling our Samaritan obligations to refugees and migrants.
Providing that essential aid.
Yeah, but then the model takes it a step further, and
Hmm.
it says, okay, we have to also look at those deeper measures, like addressing those root causes of migration that we talked about.
So it's about recognizing that our responsibilities don't just end at our national borders. We have to do our part in creating a world that's more just and equitable so that fewer people will feel like they have no choice but to leave their homes.
Exactly. It's a much more ambitious approach, and it really forces us to think about how interconnected we all are as a global community.
Wow. Well, I think it's safe to say that we've just scratched the surface here. But for all you philosophers out there, hopefully this deep dive has given you some stuff to think about.
For sure. That tension between national identity and global responsibility, it's something that we all need to grapple with, both as individuals and as a society.
Absolutely. And as you keep thinking about all this, I'll leave you with this final thought. In a world that's increasingly interconnected, how can we balance the very real needs of these national communities with this moral imperative to address these global injustices and make sure that everybody is taken care of, no matter where they come from? It's a question that requires a lot of careful thought and some pretty brave action. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.